Well, hello again. And so now we're looking at week 3, the integumentary system. And our slide says here, this it calls the integumentary system the skin, and this is not correct. The integumentary system is a little bit more than just the skin. The skin is a specific part, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I'm going to enlarge this picture so we can look at a few things. First, the integumentary system is going to be made up of 3 layers. You've got an outer layer, I've got a very large middle layer, and then a bottommost layer. I'm going to start with this bottommost layer. The bottommost layer can be called by 2 different names. It can either be the hypodermis or it can be called the subcutaneous. And I'm going to come back to both of those terms in just a second. We're not going to really deal a lot with this layer. What I do want you to know or associate it with is it is going to be mainly adipose tissue that is going to be kind of how it rests on. So how the rest of the integumentary rests on it. So the middle one, the main layer here, is called the dermis, and so the fact that the one at the bottom can be called the hypodermis, that's why, because this is the dermis, and hypo means below. Now, since hypo means below, I want to tell you what the name of this uppermost layer is, and it is the epidermis. Remember, we said epi means above. That's a really bad E there, but you can see it a little bit there. Epi means above. So I've got the dermis, which is the middle, the main layer. So I've got the epidermis above that, and then I have the hypodermis below that. Now, the skin itself is actually, scientifically, these top 2 layers. The epidermis and the dermis together make up what we can scientifically truly call the skin, and it actually is what we would call the cutaneous membrane, the largest organ of the body. Now, the liver is the largest internal organ, but the largest organ altogether is called the cutaneous membrane, and that's what we call the skin. So that is also why this bottom layer can sometimes be called the subcutaneous layer, because it is underneath. Sub means underneath. So it could be called the subcutaneous or hypodermis. Now, again, like I said, we don't deal with that bottom layer too often, but it is where the adipose tissue is found. The adipose tissue is the most abundant tissue there. Now, I'm going to go over some parts to this, and then I'm going to click to different slides where I'll enlarge things so that we can see them. But just to go over a few parts here, and I'm going to erase all of this right now. So the overall view is that we have 3 layers. The epidermis is the outermost, and we looked at that last time in the histology lab. The epidermis is going to be what we looked at as stratified squamous. When you get in lecture, you'll learn that there's some other cells that are going to be in there. So when I say it's mainly that. Now, the cells in the epidermis, again in lecture you'll learn, are called keratinocytes because of this specialized protein called keratin that gives it the protective quality. And we'll talk a little bit about that in another time. So we've got those 3 layers. Then probably some of the things we'll look at, this is a sweat gland. Now, there's 2 types of sweat glands that are going to be found in this area. This is one that would be called a merocrine sweat gland. And this would be a sweat gland that has a duct, as you see right here, that goes all the way up. And even though, because of the way the picture looks, it looks like it might be associated with that hair, it's not. It comes out to the surface. There's another type of sweat gland called an apocrine sweat gland that its duct comes over and it attaches to the hair. And you'll look in lecture at the difference of the two. The apocrine, the one that attaches to the hair, is going to be found in the axillary or armpit region, and then the groin region. They're going to be associated with puberty. They become active at puberty. Where this ecrine, and the ecrine is also sometimes called miracrine. I should have said both of those earlier. The one that comes out and dumps its fluid on the surface. These are active throughout life, and they're really about temperature regulation. They're what we would really consider true sweat glands. Now, again, this little model has this, and it's just a sweat gland, and it is specifically a miracrine / ecrine sweat gland. Then we get to what is the hair. Now this, and I'm going to just circle this whole guy right here. The hair is going to have a couple of different things. I do want you to know there's a dividing line here. Things above, once we get into the epidermis and then finally out to the outer world, that is called the hair shaft. Everything below that is called the hair root. And then the hair root's going to be surrounded by this big, on this model, it looks like kind of a nasty gray carrot. That's called the hair follicle. This one over on this side has been cut in half, so you can kind of see some of the layers. We don't have to know those layers in here. You just need to know that this is the hair follicle. It basically surrounds the hair root and protects it basically while it's killing it. And as the hair moves up here, I'm going to have this type of a gland that's going to secrete something called sebum. Again, you'll learn that more in lecture, but this oily substance called sebum onto the hair, because at this point it is about to leave the follicle and go out to the cold, cruel world, and so that sebum helps waterproof the hair. Now this gland is called a sebaceous gland. So we've got a sweat gland here, and this sweat gland is a miracrine or ecrine sweat gland. Both of those are equally correct. There is a type of sweat gland that is not on this picture that has a duct that comes and attaches here on the hairs. That is called an apocrine sweat gland. And then you have this miracrine sweat gland. So those are some of the glands. Now, what I'm going to look at, and now that we've kind of looked at some of the hair, I want to look at the epidermis. I want to look at the epidermis so that we can see some of the. So if I take this little part and enlarge it, it'll look like this. All right, so now we see this. Hopefully you can kind of see what I was talking about. So I'm going to use my little red marker here to highlight the membrane, the basement membrane, as it kind of waves up and down through here. And I'll dot, 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 go through here and then on around. Now I kind of jumped ahead with the hair because I was just so excited about it. But so looking at the epidermis, there are layers in the epidermis, and those layers are called stratum. And stratum is just a fancy word that means layers, stratified, like we talked about with the tissues. It just means layers. So there's 5 layers. Again, you'll look at this in lecture. Now I'm going to draw again on this little part here, and I'm going to highlight this darker band at the very bottom, and you can kind of see it there. I won't highlight it, but you can kind of see it there. That's the bottommost layer, and it is called the stratum basal. Now in lab, you're only responsible for the bottommost layer and the outermost layer. So this little layer here at the bottom is called the stratum basal. It is 1 cell layer thick of very mitotic cells, which just means they're going through mitosis very quickly. So they're constantly reproducing. They're constantly bubbling up. And every time a new cell is formed, it's pushed up, and it's going to get into this layer. And the very first part, and I'll kind of draw a little imaginary line here. This little layer here is called the stratum spumosum. And this stratum is alive and well. Now, you don't have to identify this in lab. I'm just going to tell you what they are. You'll go over them in lecture. The ones you have to know in lab are the innermost and the outermost. So we looked at the stratum basal. This is one you do need to know, the stratum basal here, the innermost layer. This is the stratum spumosum, and then as these cells continue to get pushed up, they start developing this thing called keratin in them. And so they start developing granules of keratin. And so this layer, this third layer, starting from the bottom, if I've got this is the first layer, this is the second layer, this third layer is called the stratum granulosum. These cells are starting to develop granules of keratin and starting to die, basically. So it's like an escalator to death. The new ones get born here. As they push up, they start developing the granules, and they start aging like they're going to die. And they do. And so then we have this fourth layer, and this fourth layer is kind of weird. The fourth layer is not found everywhere. It's really only found in two main places, the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet. It's called the stratum lucidium. And so it's a very unique area. It helps kind of protect things. The bottommost, because our palms of our hands, soles of our feet are under a lot of pressure. Now the outermost layer, this guy right here, is called the stratum corneum. These cells are dead, flattened cells. When we were looking at the tissue slides and I showed you the cell, you could see the cells that were dying and sloughing off. Those were the very outermost part of the stratum corneum. Now, when I was growing up, I remember my grandmother calling and it's not a wart, but a hardened area on your skin, she would call it a corn. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that. And I used to just think that was weird and just thought she was referring to corn like as what you eat. But now I realize that even though she didn't know what she was saying, the name comes from a hardened spot on the stratum corneum. That's where you get the word corn. Now, in lab, again, the only two that you have to be able to identify is this outermost layer, the stratum corneum, and this innermost layer, the stratum basal. Now, I can't remember right now if I did say this, but stratum basal, the word basal in science means bottom. So as you go farther along, you're going to see a few things that'll have basal or basali in the name. For instance, when you study white blood cells, if you did before, if this is, if you had a prereq and you looked at the white blood cells, the least common of the white blood cells is called the basophil. The reason it's called basophil is because it is at the bottom. So basal means bottom. So you've got these two that you need to know, the stratum corneum, the outermost, and the stratum basal, that innermost layer. The other thing that I want to point out here, and I probably should come back to this, is that there are two types of structures that are going to be in this little wavy area. One of them is a finger-like capillary bed this is called the dermal papilla. Papilla means finger-like. And so the reason that this area has this wavy basement membrane is because, remember, epithelial tissue, which is what the epidermis is, does not have direct blood supply. Now these cells in the stratum basal are some of the most mitotic. They are the quickest dividing cells, some of them, in the body. And so as these are going through mitosis and really reproducing and pushing up, it needs a lot of blood supply. It's going to need a lot of oxygen. It's going to need to get rid of a lot of carbon dioxide. So this little finger-like capillary, as it sticks up, this area forms a dome around it. Now we only see it look like a little arch around it because it's been cut in half, but understand 360, it's like a little dome, like you stuck your hand up into one of those grocery bags from the store or whatever. So this is called the dermal papilla, and it's the papillary, and it's going to sound funny, the papillary capillary, the finger-like capillary that is bringing the nutrients to the dermis. That's why it's called the dermal papilla. Now the other one is in this little area, it looks like a little lollipop. There's one that's cut in half and one that's whole here. These are called Meissner corpuscles. Meissner corpuscles. If you looked at your student handouts, you'll see that on there. We're going to look at, not only are we going to look at another papilla capillary, but we're also going to look at another corpuscle in just a minute. But that's what these are. All right, these little lollipop things, they're right there where all these dermal papillae are, and they're called Meissner corpuscles. They're for really fine touch, light touch, palpation it's called, where you just kind of, like if you were trying to learn to read Braille, you would be really exercising your Meissner corpuscles. Now, I don't know if it's funny how many people don't know what a miser is. A miser, like if you've ever read A Christmas Story, Ebenezer Scrooge is considered a miser. He's a penny pincher. Now, when I was in school, we could remember that we could tell the date. A miser can tell the date on a coin because he uses his Meissner corpuscles. Now, I don't know if that'll help, but hopefully that does. So anyway, so those are some of the areas in this, some of the things in this area. We've got the dermal papilla, we've got the Meissner corpuscles. This whole section is the epidermis, and the epidermis is going to have the several stratum layers, and the bottommost layer is the stratum basal, the outermost layer is the stratum corneum. So now we're going to move on a little bit. I'm going to point in on this part real quick. So if I enlarge it, you'll see, and it's not a great picture, but you see this capillary bed coming here. What's happening is, in the hair, you've got a little area here that is the alive cells, kind of like the stratum basal, and as they reproduce cells, the cells get pushed up along the hair root, and it's protected and then killed by the hair follicle until it makes its way out. Then this little guy on this outer picture here, the sebaceous gland, dumps the sebum on it as it moves out. But this part here, we talked about the dermal papilla or papillae, the dermal capillary bed. This is a papilla that's going to the hair, so it's called the hair papillae. And so that's comparable to the one in the dermis. So I wanted to highlight that and enlarge it and point it out. So this is going back to the regular picture of seeing it. So we've got the epidermis with its stratum corneum on the outside, this little stratum basal on the inside. We've got dermal papillary beds here, and then we've got hair papilla here that's bringing the nutrients in. We've got the hair root and then the hair shaft. Now, I just want to warn you, those two are not on your student handouts, but I do expect you to know that. The dividing line is actually the basement membrane between the dermis and the epidermis. So every part of the hair above that is called the hair root. Every part below it is called the hair shaft. And the hair shaft is surrounded by the hair follicle. And right when the hair root is about to leave, it gets worked on by this gland called the sebaceous gland. So that's kind of a little review of what we've gone over so far on this. There's only a few other parts. I want to look at this muscle here. Every hair is going to have this muscle. It's a smooth muscle called the erector pilli muscle. Pilli means pillar. Erect means standing upright, and it's a muscle. This is the muscle. Every hair has one. It's going to be attached to the basement membrane here and into the bottom of the hair follicle. When it contracts, it causes the hair to stand upright. If you've ever had goosebumps or chill bumps, sometimes they're called. It's the erector pilli muscles that contract to try to, and your hair raises up. Now, one of the things just to understand, what it does is when you're cold, if you ever got that shiver and you got quote-unquote goosebumps, every muscle contraction, over 50% of the energy, like some of the energy is going to be mechanical energy, this tension that it forms, but over half of all the energy is lost to the surrounding as heat. And so when you get that chill bump, what's going on is your body's cold and it's sending a signal to all of these guys to get them to contract to hopefully warm you up. But that's the erector pili muscle. One of the last things is going to be this this other corpuscle. So we looked at the Meissner corpuscle here, but we now have this much larger and deeper corpuscle called the Pacchian corpuscle. The Pacchian corpuscle is going to be on the deeper part of the dermis, and it is going to be for more heavy pressure. So like if someone grabs you or you kind of feel that deep pressure. So these Meissner corpuscles are for very light pressure, but if something puts too much pressure, that kind of blows them out of the water and they get overloaded. And that's when these guys come in. They're Pacchian corpuscles for heavier pressure. One of the ways I remembered it when I was in school and everybody was in dorms and stuff, if someone moved, man, it stunk because you'd have to help them move. And when you're talking about moving students, you're moving boxes of books, and books are heavy. So I remember if you didn't pack well, you had some heavy pressure that you had to lift. And that was how I kind of remembered it. I try to tie things together in kind of goofy ways like that. So just as a review, I'm going to look at this next slide, which is the picture from the book, and I'm going to use it to kind of go over some of the parts. So on this, I've enlarged it a little bit. We have the layers. We have the epidermis. We have the dermis. And then we have the subcutaneous down here. Subcutaneous, again, mainly seen as adipose tissue. And again, subcutaneous or hypodermis. Then we go back up here to the epidermis. We have the outermost layer, which is the stratum corneum. And then this innermost layer, which is the stratum basal. All right, now we went over the ones in between there. You do not have to know them in lab. I just wanted to point them out while I was looking at it. So stratum corneum, stratum basal. Now we look at the hair. In the hair, we have a dividing line at the basement membrane. We have the hair shaft, which is above it, the hair root, which is below it. The hair root is surrounded by something called the hair follicle. And then at the very end of the hair follicle, you have something called the sebaceous gland, which is going to drop off the sebum to help waterproof that hair as it goes out to the cold, cruel world. We have sweat glands. I don't know why that did like that, but sweat glands here and here. Both of these are Meissner or eccrine, Miracrine or eccrine sweat glands. Sorry about the Meissner things. I was happened to catch my eye on that. Sorry about that. But Miracrine or eccrine sweat glands. If I was looking for an apocrine sweat gland, it would be this little coiled up thing here, and then the duct would go and attach to the hair right where the sebaceous glands are. The last few things, we have Meissner corpuscles that are going to be associated with these dermal ridges. They can sometimes be called tactile, but our book calls them Meissner corpuscles. They're for light touch. And then we have these Pacchian corpuscles. Here it also is called laminated because they have these layers. Now understand that in this picture, these really should be a little bit lower. They're very much more associated with the bottom part of the dermis. And then finally, we have two types of capillary beds. We have these capillary beds here, which are bringing the good stuff to the dermis, so they're called dermal capillary, dermal papillae, and then we have the one here that's bringing the good nutrients to the hair root as it grows, and it is called the hair papilla or papillae. And so that's the integumentary system. It's a pretty straightforward system, fairly short lab. I hope everybody understands that and it's clear. Again, when we meet in lab, hopefully we'll have time, or if you have any questions about this, we can go over them. Have a great day.